When I was very young, my life was filled with situations that, in retrospect, bordered on the surreal. We lived in a townhouse, one of those modest homes lined up like soldiers along the neighborhood streets. The facade of our house wasn't any different from the others. A simple front door, small windows, and a front yard that could barely be called a yard. But what happened in our backyard and inside our four walls was anything but ordinary. My mother, always with a flair for the eccentric, decided one day against all local ordinances and common sense that what our family needed wasn't a dog or a cat, but a horse. And not just any horse. It was an ex-racehorse, a massive, energetic animal that had left the racetracks behind to find a home in our small backyard. When I think about it now, I realize how absurd it was. A horse in a space barely large enough for a couple of small trees and some flowers. The horse, named Viento, was a magnificent creature with a glossy coat and an alert gaze that always intimidated me a bit. I remember how his presence caused a stir in the neighborhood. The neighbors would murmur and look on with disapproval every time they passed by our house. But my mother was unfazed. To her, Viento was just another member of the family, someone who deserved to be cared for and loved, no matter the rules. However, the story doesn't end there. Viento didn't come alone. Along with him came a goat, a small, skittish creature that quickly became his inseparable companion. My mother, in her characteristic style, decided that the goat, whom we named Trufa, needed a special place to sleep. So instead of building a shed or a shelter in the backyard, she decided that the closet in my nursery would be the perfect spot. I vaguely remember how, every night, Trufa would curl up in that little space while I slept just a few feet away. Her soft bleating was part of the soundtrack of my childhood, and I never thought there was anything unusual about sharing my room with a goat. To me, it was simply part of everyday life. The days passed in a strange but happy way. My mother took care of Viento and Trufa as if they were her children, and I grew up in the middle of that charming chaos. The other kids in the neighborhood couldn't believe it when I told them about my roommates, and their parents would often look at me with a mix of disbelief and concern. But at home, everything seemed normal, or at least, that's what I thought for a long time. As I grew older, I began to realize that our situation wasn't exactly common. The neighbors' whispers became more audible, and I started noticing the lingering looks they gave us whenever we took Viento for a walk down the street. But what really changed my perspective was a discovery I made years later, when I was a bit older and starting to understand that not everything my mother did was as innocent as it seemed. One day, while playing in the basement, I found something that left me speechless. A grow operation carefully hidden behind a plastic curtain. There were plants that, at the time, I didn't recognize but later learned were illegal. Fluorescent lights glowed over the green leaves, and the constant hum of fans filled the air. It was a completely different world from the one I knew, a world my mother had kept hidden even from me. When I confronted my mother about it, she simply smiled and told me it was a little project she had been working on. She didn't offer any further explanation, and I, still too young to grasp the implications, decided not to press the issue. But that discovery planted a seed of doubt in my mind, one that would only grow with the years. As I got older, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. My mother's eccentricity wasn't just an expression of her personality. It was also her way of defying norms, of living a life on the fringes of society's expectations. Viento and Trufa weren't just pets. They were symbols of her quiet rebellion, her refusal to conform to what was expected of her. Now, looking back, I see those years with a mix of awe and understanding. My childhood, while peculiar, was rich with experiences that taught me to question what is considered normal, and to accept that sometimes the people you love the most can be the hardest to understand. My mother, with her racehorse in the backyard and her goat in my closet, showed me that life can be as extraordinary as you're willing to make it, and that sometimes, breaking the rules is simply a way of finding your own path. And although Viento and Trufa are no longer around and the grow operation in the basement is just a distant memory, the lesson from that time remains clear. Life is full of surprises, and what seems like a simple act of madness can, in reality, be an act of love and freedom. When I was 9 years old, my teacher assigned us a project that seemed simple at first glance: to research our family tree. At that age, I didn't understand the depth of what that really meant. The project involved basic questions like, who our grandparents and great-grandparents were and where they came from. But there was one question in particular that caught my attention. When did your family emigrate to America, and why? While my classmates quickly responded with typical stories like, "My family came in search of work," or "They came for a better future," I didn't know exactly what to say. My parents had never talked much about our family history, and there seemed to be an uncomfortable silence around the topic. So I decided to ask my grandmother, who seemed to be the person closest to those times. I remember it was a cold autumn afternoon when I sat next to her at her house. The air smelled of dry leaves and the vegetable soup she always made. My grandmother, with her hair already white and her calm gaze, looked at me when I asked the question. At first, she gave me a response that seemed simple and logical. Life in Poland was becoming very difficult. There was a shortage of food, few opportunities, and the threat of war. At that moment, as a child, I accepted that answer without doubt. After all, World War I was brewing in Europe, and for a Polish teenager, that must have been dangerous enough to want to leave. However, over the years, something inside me remained restless. There was something about the way my grandmother had said those words, in her distant gaze, that made me suspect she wasn't telling me the whole story. But like many children, I didn't question the adults and continued with my life, carrying that simplified version of events as the absolute truth. What I didn't know at the time was that my great-grandfather hadn't just emigrated because of economic hardships or the looming war, but for something much darker. Something that, if known back then, would have forever changed the way I saw my family. A few years passed before we spoke about the topic again. By then I was a teenager, naturally curious and more aware of the complexities of life. I had learned that history is rarely as simple as it seems on the surface, and I felt there was a crucial part of my great-grandfather's story that I still didn't know. It was during a family gathering, after everyone had gone to bed and only my grandmother and I remained sitting in front of the fireplace, that I decided to ask her again. This time I wouldn't settle for a vague answer. At first, my grandmother tried to evade the question, as she had done so many times before. But after I insisted, she looked at me intently with a mix of resignation and sadness in her eyes and said, "It's a story I never wanted you to hear. There are things in life that are better left unsaid." However, knowing that I wouldn't stop asking, she began to tell me a version of events I could never have imagined. It turns out my great-grandfather, as just a teenager, had fallen in love with an older woman. And she wasn't just any woman. She was married, something that, at that time and in his small rural Polish village, was considered an unforgivable sin. According to my grandmother, this woman, with her captivating beauty, had stolen my great-grandfather's heart, who, in his youth and inexperience, couldn't resist the temptation. Their encounters became frequent, secretive, and filled with a passion they both knew was forbidden. Life in the small village was quiet, but rumors traveled fast. And it wasn't long before the woman's husband, a large, violent man, began to suspect. The villagers were known for being close-knit and traditional, and any scandal could mean the end of a family's reputation. Consumed by jealousy and rage, the husband began following his wife, determined to uncover the truth. My great-grandfather, for his part, was too young and naive to understand the consequences of his actions. In his mind, there was only room for the love he felt for that woman. One afternoon, after a secret meeting, the husband confronted my great-grandfather. He was a big man with a stern face and rough hands from years of working in the fields. It wasn't a peaceful confrontation. Full of anger, the man attacked my great-grandfather without saying a word, hitting him and shouting accusations that echoed through the narrow streets of the village. My great-grandfather, scared and unsure how to react, tried to defend himself. But in the midst of the struggle, the unexpected happened. The husband tripped over a rock as he tried to strike my great-grandfather, fell backward, and his head hit brutally against the edge of a stone wall. The sound of the impact was sharp, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. My great-grandfather, paralyzed with fear, stood still for a few seconds, watching as the man didn't get up. Blood began to flow from the husband's head, staining the cobblestone ground. In the blink of an eye, my great-grandfather realized what he had done. He had killed a man, even if it wasn't his intention. Fear gripped him in a way he had never experienced before. He knew he had no chance to defend himself if they found out. In such a small village, where everyone knew each other and honor codes were everything, the fact that he had killed the husband of a woman he was involved with in a forbidden relationship was a death sentence. Justice was swift and brutal, and a family's stained honor was an unforgivable offense. That same night, my great-grandfather made the most difficult decision of his life. He fled. He didn't have time to say goodbye to his family or the woman he loved. He knew that if he stayed, not only would he be arrested, but they would likely lynch him before he even had a chance to explain what had happened. He escaped with only the clothes on his back, knowing he could never return. Days later, he boarded a ship bound for America. The journey was long and filled with uncertainty. On board, he changed his name, hoping that his past wouldn't catch up with him in the new world. As the ship crossed the Atlantic, my great-grandfather reflected on the life he had left behind. The images of the village, his family, and most of all, the lifeless body of the man he had killed haunted him every night. He knew he could never erase what he had done, but at least he had the chance to start over. When he arrived in America, my great-grandfather found work as a laborer in a factory. It was a hard life, but he was grateful for the opportunity to begin anew. He married, had children, and for many years, kept his dark past a secret. He never spoke of what had happened in Poland, not even to his wife or children. To everyone, he was simply another immigrant who had come to America in search of a better life. But within him, the ghosts of his past remained alive, tormenting him in his moments of solitude. My grandmother ended her story with a warning. "Some things are better left in the past," she told me in a serious tone, as if simply telling me the story had reopened old wounds. She made me promise not to share the story with anyone else, and to stick with the original version for the school project. He emigrated because life was hard and dangerous in Poland. I then understood why she had wanted to keep the story simple. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that their great-grandfather didn't just flee war and poverty, but also an accidental killing? Family stories aren't always as we tell them, and sometimes the darkest secrets are those that are never fully revealed. For much of my childhood, from the age of 6 to 13, I lived on an old farm with my mother and sister. It was a large, worn-out house surrounded by vast fields, endless hills, and a dense forest that always seemed to be lurking. The farm, with its slanted roof and peeling facade, was both our refuge and a place filled with mystery. On the outside, it could have been the typical image of a rural home on a postcard, but inside it held much deeper stories than my sister and I could comprehend at the time. Our life on the farm seemed in many ways idyllic. We ran through open fields, chased butterflies in the spring, and picked apples from the old orchard in the fall. However, like any home, there were shadows hanging over us. The most significant of them was Murray, my mother's boyfriend. He came into our lives when I was 6 years old, and for many years he was the father figure we had never had before. He was tall, burly, with a thick beard and a laugh that echoed through the house, filling the dark corners with a warmth that, at the time, we deeply appreciated. Murray, in the eyes of my sister and me, was a sort of everyday hero. He was the one who fixed things when they broke, took us fishing on weekends, and told us stories by the fireplace during the long winter nights. I remember how he taught us to build a fire in the backyard, how we laughed watching him fail to light it with just one match, and how, when he finally succeeded, he'd sit with us, sharing life lessons mixed with anecdotes from his youth. But there was another side to Murray, one we only began to notice over time. Despite being so loving and protective with us, Murray had a very serious problem. He drank too much. And it wasn't just that he drank at night to relax. He drank excessively, and the worst part was that he had no qualms about getting into his truck and driving in that state. To us as children, that part of his life was shrouded in a kind of haze. We knew something was wrong when he staggered as he walked, or when his voice became deeper and slurred after several beers, but our mother always tried to downplay the issue. "He's just tired," she'd say, or, "He's had a long day at work." Over the years, we grew accustomed to those justifications, until one particular incident changed everything. It was a summer night, hot and stifling, the kind of night where the air doesn't move and everything is covered in a sticky blanket of humidity. The tension in the air was palpable. Murray had been drinking more than usual, and after arguing with my mother about something I didn't fully understand, he decided to drive his old truck. The sound of the engine roaring into the darkness made my sister and me exchange worried glances. It was a sound we knew well, and every time we heard it in those moments, we knew something bad could happen. Hours later, when he finally returned, he wasn't the same man who had left. The truck was wrecked, with the windshield shattered and one of the tires almost completely flat. Murray, staggering, emerged from the vehicle covered in blood, with torn clothes and a pale face. My mother, who had been trying to keep calm in the kitchen until that moment, ran to him. I remember how she hugged him while he could barely stand. The fear in her eyes left me frozen. I knew that this time, it was much more serious than anything we had experienced before. That night was different. My mother didn't let him stay in the house as she usually did. After he was treated at the hospital, she made it clear that things couldn't continue this way. Although Murray promised to change, I knew those promises no longer meant anything to her. That was the night my mother made the decision to leave him. For years, I thought that had been the only reason she left him. His drinking problem and the risks he took by driving under the influence. But, as I would discover later, that was only a small part of the story. Over the years, my sister and I had learned never to go down to the basement. It wasn't just because our mother had forbidden it, but because it was infested with spiders. As kids, we had a terrifying image of that dark, damp place, where cobwebs covered every corner and insects scurried silently through the shadows. But we never questioned why Murray spent so much time down there or what he was really doing in that space. One day, as an adult, during a casual conversation with my mother, she let slip a detail she had never mentioned before. "Do you remember how I never let you go down to the basement?" she asked while stirring a cup of tea. I nodded, thinking she was referring to the spiders. But then she continued. "It wasn't just because of that. Murray had a clandestine operation down there. It turns out that in addition to his drinking problem, Murray was involved in something much more dangerous. He had turned the basement into a massive marijuana growing operation. He used special lights, ventilation, and a makeshift irrigation system to keep the plants growing. My mother had discovered this long after we had started living with him, and when she did, fear overwhelmed her. She knew that if the police found out, not only would they arrest Murray, but she would lose custody of us. That constant threat of us being separated haunted her every day. The tension in the house was palpable. Every time someone knocked on the door, my mother held her breath, fearing it was the police. Every time she heard the sound of a car approaching, her heart raced, expecting the worst. Living under that kind of stress became unsustainable. The truck accident was just the last straw. She knew she had to leave, that she couldn't keep exposing us to that risk. Murray never changed. Even after my mother left with us, he remained the same man, trapped in his own problems and secrets. He never stopped being the Murray we fondly remembered, the man who taught us to fish and told us stories by the fire. But behind that facade, there was always something darker lurking. The fact that, years later, marijuana became legal in the country is an irony I can't help but notice. Murray would have laughed knowing that what was once a clandestine and dangerous operation is now something completely accepted by society. But for my mother, the risk was never a joke. She knew that her daughters' lives were at stake, and she made the hardest decision of her life by taking us down a different path. The farm, with all its stories and secrets, remains a place I return to in my thoughts. But over time, I've learned that life is full of nuances. Murray wasn't a villain, but he wasn't a hero either. He was simply a man caught in his own decisions that, in the end, affected all of us. My parents met when they were 14 years old in a small town in the United Kingdom, during a time when teenagers experienced their first loves with intensity and without fear of consequences. My mother was a studious, intelligent young woman who was very clear about what she wanted in life. She had always been the best student in her class, with a clear focus on her future. She knew that her studies would be the key to opening doors to a better life, to a prestigious university, and eventually, to a successful career. On the other hand, there was my father. He wasn't the type of guy a mother would recommend for her daughter. He had no interest in studies, let alone a structured future. He was the rebellious boy, the one who skipped classes to hang out with his friends at the back of the school, smoking and laughing loudly at anything. He had undeniable charisma, that kind of carefree charm that often attracts those seeking something different. But while others saw him as the bad boy to have fun with, my mother had a stable life and was already dating someone else. Her boyfriend at the time was an 18-year-old young man, mature for his age, with future plans similar to hers. A young man who seemed to have everything under control, something my mother, of course, deeply admired. However, everything changed when my father saw her for the first time. For him, it was as if the world had stopped. He looked at her and knew deep down that he had to be with her. It didn't matter that she already had a boyfriend or that their worlds were completely opposite. My father, with his obsessive nature and stubbornness, decided that he would do anything to make my mother leave everything and notice him. What followed was a relentless pursuit. My father persistently harassed her. Not a day went by when he didn't seek her out, sending her letters, flowers stolen from other people's gardens, or showing up at places where he knew she would be. He literally begged her to consider him. Every time my mother rejected him, he came back with a different strategy, with a new promise or a new trick to get her attention. My mother, although she was firm in her refusal at first, gradually began to give in to so much persistence. After all, no one had ever pursued her that way, with so much passion and determination. Wasn't that love? Finally, after months of this relentless campaign, my mother decided to leave her boyfriend. She broke off a stable, sensible relationship for a boy she barely knew, but who had shown he was willing to do anything for her. Perhaps at that moment, she believed she had made the right decision, that this intense display of love meant he was the one. But in reality, she had taken the first step on a path full of complications. Once my mother and father started dating, their differences became more apparent. While my mother remained focused on her studies and her future, my father continued to live his life without any worries. His only concern seemed to be having fun and enjoying his youth to the fullest. He didn't see the value in academic effort or long-term commitment. For him, life was an endless party, and he saw no reason to change that. When they finished secondary school, my parents' lives took very different paths. My mother, with her usual dedication, went to university. She knew it was her chance to build a solid career, to meet the expectations she had always had for herself. My father, on the other hand, dropped out of school without a second thought. He didn't see the need to continue with formal education and instead went straight into the workforce. He got a basic job that allowed him to cover his expenses and, more importantly, keep drinking and partying as if nothing had changed. During this time, the distance between my parents began to grow. My mother, immersed in her studies, barely had time to see my father, who, for his part, remained surrounded by his circle of friends, parties, and long nights filled with alcohol. My mother was dedicated to learning, studying for exams, and building a stable future. My father, on the other hand, lived day by day, without worrying about what tomorrow might bring. And it was at one of those parties where everything fell apart. One night, while my mother was in the midst of her most important exams, my father, caught up in the chaos of the party, ended up cheating on her. It was a slip, an impulsive moment, but one that would change everything. He was with a girl from his old secondary school, someone he had had a brief history with years ago. It wasn't premeditated, but an impulsive act by someone living in the moment without thinking about the consequences. However, when my mother found out about the betrayal, there was no turning back. It didn't matter how much my father tried to apologize or how much he promised to change. My mother, true to her principles and deeply hurt by the betrayal, decided she was done. She left him without a second thought, closing the door on a relationship that at that moment seemed destined to fail. Time passed, and during that year my mother moved on with her life. She focused on finishing university, surrounded herself with new friends, and left behind everything my father represented. To her, he was just a mistake from the past, a lesson learned, and she was convinced she would never fall into that trap again. Meanwhile, my father, after the initial excitement of his party life faded, began to face a harsh reality. Without my mother, his life became chaotic. He had no direction, no support, and soon realized he didn't know how to do anything for himself. He was no longer the fun, carefree boy he had been in his youth. The friends he used to party with began to drift away, each following their own path, and my father found himself alone, sinking into an emotional and personal void. It was then that he realized he had lost everything. No one wanted him anymore, and the life he had built around partying and carelessness no longer served him. Desperate and not knowing what else to do, he decided to return to the only person who had ever truly loved him, my mother. It wasn't a triumphant return, nor a romantic reconquest. My father came back with his head down, crawling, acknowledging that he had lost her, and that without her, he didn't know how to move forward. Despite everything that had happened, my mother, in a gesture that still baffles me to this day, took him back. But this time, the conditions were different. When my father returned to my mother's life, it wasn't as the confident, carefree boy he had once been. This time he came back broken, aware of his mistakes and that without her, he didn't know how to manage his life. But my mother, by accepting his return, didn't do it out of blind love or nostalgia. She knew what she wanted and what she demanded of him for the relationship to work, if it ever had in the first place. "I'll take you back," she said, "but only on my terms." And those terms weren't negotiable. She asked him to commit to prove he was someone trustworthy, to leave behind his chaotic life. "If you're going to be with me, we'll get married," she said, laying out the only path that, for her, was possible. My father, fearing losing her forever, accepted without thinking too much, even though marriage wasn't something he had wanted at that moment. From that moment on, the pressure began. Over the next year, although they both tried to rekindle their relationship, my mother began to talk more and more about getting married. It wasn't something she wanted to delay. For her, marriage was a sort of guarantee, a promise that my father would finally be by her side forever. So just after she turned 22, my mother was already pressuring him to propose. My father, although he agreed in theory, didn't share the same enthusiasm. Deep down, he knew that marriage wouldn't solve their problems or change the dynamic between them. But he was trapped. After all, he had come back to my mother because he didn't see any other option, because he didn't know how to be alone. And if getting married was what she wanted, he thought he had to do it to keep the peace. He decided that if he was going to propose, he would do it in the best way possible. My father didn't have big aspirations in life, but he did intend to do this right. He knew my mother had always dreamed of Paris, the city of love, and that she had told him how she wanted to be proposed to there, in front of the Eiffel Tower, under the sparkling lights that lit up the night sky. So he decided to plan everything. They were going to travel to Paris and he would finally propose to her. Everything was planned. The trip to Paris, the Eiffel Tower, the ring in his pocket. My father was determined that this would be the moment when my mother would see him as the man who had matured, the man who was finally ready to commit to her for life. He wanted to give her the proposal of her dreams, the one she had always imagined since she was a girl, looking at pictures of Paris in fashion magazines. The trip started off well. They arrived in Paris, walked through streets filled with history and art, marveled at the grandeur of the monuments, and enjoyed meals in small cafes along the avenues. Everything seemed perfect, and my mother, unaware of what was about to happen, was thrilled. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, and it was finally about to happen. But as often happens with my father, things didn't go as planned. After a long day of walking through the city, they decided to visit the Eiffel Tower, the place where my mother had dreamed of receiving the proposal. My father had everything ready, or at least he thought so. But when the moment finally came, when the lights of the tower shone around them and the magic of Paris enveloped everything, he realized something devastating. He had forgotten the ring at the hotel. He tried to keep calm, but panic set in. He knew he couldn't propose without the ring, not in such a special moment. So somehow he decided to postpone the proposal until they got back to the hotel. My mother, unaware of what was happening, didn't notice my father's tension as they enjoyed the view from the Eiffel Tower, not knowing that her long-awaited proposal was about to turn into a disaster. Once back at the hotel room, my father, with no other option, decided to propose there, in that closed space, far from the glamour and magic of Paris. There were no bright lights, no Seine flowing beneath them. There wasn't the excitement my mother had imagined. It was a clumsy, rushed proposal, almost as if it were a formality that needed to be completed. But despite everything, my mother said yes. Not because the proposal had been perfect, but because deep down, She still believed he was the only person she could be with. Just a month after getting married, my mother's expectations began to grow. She knew that in her mind, the logical next step after marriage was to start a family. For her, having children was a natural extension of their relationship, a way to consolidate their life together. But for my father, the idea of having children was terrifying. He didn't want the responsibility of raising a child. He wasn't ready for the demands of parenthood, and in reality, he never had been. Still, my mother began to pressure him. Day after day, she reminded him how important it was for her to have a family. My father, once again trapped in a situation he couldn't control, finally gave in. 9 months later, I was born. My arrival into the world was a moment of joy for my mother, but for my father, it was the beginning of a new reality he had never wanted to accept. Soon, both of them realized how difficult it was to have a child. The sleepless nights, the constant responsibilities, the worries, all of it quickly overwhelmed them. My father, unable to cope with the pressure, emotionally distanced himself, while my mother, desperate to keep everything under control, also began to pull away. They didn't want to face the reality of what it meant to be parents, so instead of stepping up to their roles, they left me in the care of my grandparents. Basically, I spent my childhood under their care while my parents tried to carry on with their lives, pretending they didn't have the responsibility of raising me. After my birth, my parents' relationship was never the same. The initial illusion my mother had about the perfect marriage and family quickly crumbled, and my father, who had never wanted to be a parent in the first place, felt increasingly trapped in a life he hadn't chosen. Although they managed to get through the early years, they were never able to confront the fact that being parents required more than they were willing to give. But despite the emotional distance between them, life went on. A couple of years after I was born, my mother became pregnant again. This pregnancy was a complete accident, something neither my mother nor my father had planned. For my father, it was as if the world had collapsed around him. The very thought of having another child terrified him. He didn't want to repeat the experience, didn't want the responsibilities or the exhaustion that came with raising a baby. So in a fit of desperation, he gave my mother an ultimatum. If you don't have an abortion, I'm leaving. It was a cruel and direct threat. My mother, of course, didn't want to have an abortion. Despite everything that was happening, she felt that having another child was an opportunity to make things right, to form a family that worked, even if only on the surface. But the idea of losing my father terrified her. She still believed that somehow their relationship could be saved, that the marriage she had built with so much effort still had hope. So instead of giving in to his threat, she decided to manipulate him in another way. My mother promised him that if he stayed, he wouldn't have to raise this baby. She told him it would be entirely her responsibility, that he wouldn't have to worry or get involved. It was a deal that, although unbalanced and based on fear, my father accepted. And so my first brother was born. As expected, my father played no role in his life. He didn't participate in important decisions, didn't help with daily tasks, and rarely spent time with him. My mother, for her part, didn't fully dedicate herself to parenting either. She was so emotionally exhausted that in many ways she distanced herself too. In the end, it was my responsibility to take care of my brother, assuming an adult role much earlier than I should have. But the story doesn't end there. Shortly after my first brother began to walk, my mother accidentally became pregnant again. This time, my father was furious. He felt betrayed, as if the cycle would never end. Again, he demanded that my mother have an abortion. And again, she refused. But as before, she promised him he wouldn't have to raise this new baby. My father, exhausted by the arguments and tension, once again agreed. Thus, my second brother was born. And just like with the first, my father remained distant, uninvolved in parenting or daily life. My mother, although she didn't completely abandon my brothers, also didn't fulfill the role a mother should have. She had convinced herself that the promise of he won't have to raise them also freed her from that responsibility. And so once again, I was the one who ended up taking care of my brothers. I remember those nights when I would stay up, listening to my parents argue in the next room. My mother would reproach my father for his lack of involvement, while he would remind her that he had never wanted more children in the first place. I, barely entering my teenage years, felt completely overwhelmed. While other kids my age were out with their friends or focused on school, I was caring for two babies that weren't mine, trying to fill the void my parents had left. Throughout my childhood, they always sold me the same story. The perfect love story between two people who met at 14, who overcame obstacles, and who, despite everything, managed to form a family. It was the typical romantic narrative everyone wants to hear, an idealized version of what had really happened. My parents always told how they met so young, how my father had relentlessly pursued her until she chose him, how they traveled to Paris, and how he proposed in the city of love. To anyone hearing that story, it sounded like a modern fairy tale, a couple destined to be together from the beginning. However, as with many family stories, what they sold me as the truth was only a distorted version, full of omissions and half-truths. What seemed like a story of pure love was, in reality, a twisted map of manipulation, disappointments, and wrong decisions. My mother, although she had always portrayed herself as the victim of my father's infidelities and lack of interest, had been equally manipulative. She had known from the beginning how to make my father come back to her, how to pressure him into marriage, and how to force him into a family he had never wanted. And my father, though irresponsible and selfish, had fallen into his own trap, unable to face the reality of his decisions. Over time, I began to question everything they had told me. Was it really better for my parents to stay together even though they were miserably unhappy? Was it preferable for them to remain in a toxic relationship just to keep up the appearance of a united family? Or would it have been better for them to cut ties earlier, to try to give us an example of what a healthy relationship is, even if it meant we wouldn't be together as a family? The answer to those questions has never been easy. In fact, I'm not sure there is a right answer. The only thing I know for certain is that, in the end, there was no happy ending for any of us. My parents remained trapped in their own cycle of disappointment and regret, while I, from a very young age, was forced to take on roles that weren't mine, to carry the weight of a family that was never what it seemed. Now, as an adult, I look back and see more clearly the dynamics that dominated my childhood. I better understand why my parents made the decisions they made, though I still don't agree with many of them. I also recognize the impact those decisions had on me and my brothers. We were the ones who paid the price for our parents' mistakes, the ones who grew up in a home full of tension, resentment, and broken promises. Over the years, I've tried to rebuild a relationship with them, but it hasn't been easy. Sometimes the emotional distance that was created during my childhood seems insurmountable, but I also know that to some extent I've learned from their mistakes. I've seen firsthand what a relationship based on control, manipulation, and fear can do to a family, and I've vowed not to repeat those patterns in my own life. My parents, for their part, have stayed together, although I'm not sure if that's a victory or simply a continuation of the cycle. They keep telling people their love story, the idealized version they've repeated so many times that maybe even they have started to believe in it. But I, having lived through that story from the inside, know the truth. I know that love is not always enough to sustain a relationship, and that sometimes the best decision is to let go. At the end of the day, the question remains, is it better to stay together for the sake of the children, even if that means being moderately unhappy? Or is it better to break the ties and seek a better life, even if it means doing so separately? The answer, like so many things in life, is not simple. But what I do know is that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that there is no perfect solution. The story of my family had always been a mystery to me, especially regarding my paternal grandparents. I grew up believing that we were a relatively normal family, like many others in our small town in the year 1940. We didn't have great wealth or a striking history, just daily life in a small community where everyone knew each other, and rumors flew like the wind through the streets. But as I learned later, appearances can be deceiving. What I thought was an ordinary family hid secrets much darker and more complex than I could have ever imagined. My father was a man I deeply admired. He was educated, intelligent, and moral, a true role model. I always thought that his life, and that of his parents, had been structured and, above all, morally correct. He had never hinted that his childhood had been different or problematic. I grew up admiring the idea I had of my grandparents, especially my paternal grandmother, whom I remembered as a reserved, elegant, and very well-mannered woman. But as I would discover over time, beneath that facade lay a life full of dark secrets and unthinkable decisions. When I was 12 years old, I was going through one of those winter days that seemed endless. The snow had fallen heavily over our small town, covering everything with a bright white blanket. Like every winter, my friends and I would sled down the hill behind the local funeral home, a kind of tradition we had maintained since we were little. The hill was steep, perfect for sledding races, and we always had fun sliding down the slope again and again, feeling the cold wind on our faces and hearing the excited shouts of everyone around us. That particular afternoon, I was preparing to slide down the hill when my father approached me. I remember he was wearing his thick wool coat, the same one he always wore in winter, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret at the time. There was something in his gaze, a kind of unusual seriousness. I sat on the sled, ready to push myself down, when he stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. "Before you slide down the hill, I want to tell you something," he said in a low tone, almost as if he were about to reveal a secret he had kept for years. I looked at him curiously, not knowing what to expect. "Do you see the funeral home over there?" He pointed to the old, somber building at the foot of the hill, where all the children had played without thinking about what really happened inside that place. I nodded, expecting him to tell me something about the current owner or perhaps some local story I didn't know. But what he told me was something completely different. My father, with a calmness that surprised me, began to tell me about a family secret that had been literally buried for decades. It turns out that my paternal grandmother, the woman I had always admired, had had an affair with the local undertaker in the year 1940. It was an affair that, according to him, had been kept completely secret for years, something that no one outside a few people in the family knew. What impacted me the most, however, wasn't just the fact that my grandmother had had an affair. It was what happened afterward. During her relationship with the undertaker, she became pregnant. For a woman at that time, in such a small town, an out-of-wedlock pregnancy was a scandal of unimaginable proportions. But instead of facing the consequences, the undertaker, who had access to resources most people didn't, performed an illegal abortion. The fetus, my father told me in a tone that still echoes in my head, was buried behind the funeral home. Right in the place where my friends and I had spent years sledding, laughing and playing without knowing what was buried beneath our feet. The revelation hit me like a blast of icy wind. At 12 years old, I didn't fully understand what an illegal abortion meant or how dangerous it was at that time. But the fact that something so grim had occurred in the very place I associated with fun and carefree moments made me feel uncomfortable, almost guilty. I wondered how many times I had passed by that place without knowing what lay there. And what disturbed me the most was thinking about my grandmother, that unshakable and perfect figure, being part of such a murky story. Over time, I learned to process that first revelation. It was as if, by learning about that dark family secret, I had grown up suddenly, as if a part of my innocent childhood had vanished forever. But that wasn't the only surprise my family's story had in store for me. 5 years later, when I was 17, my father decided to tell me another part of our history, one that, until then, I could never have imagined. By then, I had already begun to see the world differently, and although my grandmother's story was still shocking, I felt that nothing could surprise me more. I was wrong. I remember we were sitting in the dining room of our house one summer afternoon, while I was talking to my father about the town and the friends I had made at school. One of my best friends, a boy with whom I had shared everything since we were kids, was part of our conversation. My father, with a more serious expression than usual, interrupted me in the middle of one of my stories about him. "There's something you need to know," he said as he carefully set his cup of tea down on the table. I tensed a bit, remembering the last time he had started a conversation like that when he told me my grandmother's secret. I knew that what was coming next wouldn't be easy to digest. "Your paternal grandfather," he began to say, "was not the man you thought he was." My heart raced, knowing that another dark story was about to surface. My grandfather, according to my father, had multiple illegitimate children throughout his life. Not just one or two, but several. It was something everyone in the family knew, but had kept quiet for years to avoid scandal. In a town as small as ours, where everyone knew each other, such revelations could destroy reputations and ruin families. What shocked me the most wasn't just the fact that my grandfather had been unfaithful, but that one of those illegitimate children was someone very close to me. My best friend, with whom I had grown up and shared so many moments, turned out to be my half-cousin. My father told me this with a mixture of resignation and sincerity, as if there were no more secrets left to hide. At that moment, I felt as if the ground beneath my feet was crumbling. Everything I believed about my family, about my grandparents, and about the life we had lived in that small town, was shaken. I realized that I didn't know the full story, that I had always been living in a sort of illusion carefully constructed by the adults around me. From that day on, I couldn't see my family or my friend in the same way. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the harsh reality of what had been going on for generations. My father, whom I had always seen as a moral and upright figure, had grown up surrounded by a chaotic family full of secrets and questionable decisions. The fact that he had come out of all that as an honest and morally upright man was surprising to me. It took me a long time to reconcile with my family's story. I learned that life isn't always black and white, that people can make morally wrong decisions and still be part of you. Although my grandparents' story was a shock, it also taught me to see the world with more nuance, to understand that even in the closest families, there are hidden layers of complexity that we don't always see at first glance. And now, every time I pass by the hill behind the funeral home, I can't help but think about what's buried there, about the secrets that were never spoken aloud and how, in some way, those secrets have shaped who I am today. I was 7 years old when my father left us, and although I was too young to fully understand what that meant, I clearly remember the day he left. It was a strange day, filled with a tense silence that seemed to envelop every corner of the house. My mother told me that Dad was leaving for a while, that he needed his own space. For a 7-year-old, those words didn't make much sense, but I accepted them because I trusted my mother, and deep down I thought that, like many times before, my father would come back. That afternoon I watched him pack his things with a blank expression, moving slowly around the room as if he didn't really know what he was doing. My brother, who was only a couple of years older than me, didn't understand what was happening either. Both of us stood in the hallway, watching in silence as our lives changed forever. There were no shouts or dramatic arguments that day, but the pain on my mother's face said more than any words could express. My father closed the door behind him, and although we didn't know it at the time, that would be one of the last times we would see him. The days following his departure were strange, as if an important part of our home had suddenly disappeared. My mother told us that things simply hadn't worked out between them, that sometimes people just can't stay together and need to go their separate ways. It was a simple and direct explanation suitable for a child's mind, but even then I felt there was more to the story than they were telling us. At first, we saw him from time to time. The first 2 years after he left were a kind of unstable balance, where weekends with Dad were brief but meaningful. My brother and I would get excited when he came to pick us up, and sometimes he would take us to his new house, a place completely different from the home we had grown up in. There was something strange about this new life he was building, something I couldn't quite pinpoint, but it always made me feel a little uneasy. At that house, we met a woman whom my father had married after leaving my mother. She was kind to us, but I always felt a bit distant from her, as if she knew something we didn't yet understand. She had a son, a boy about our age, who my brother and I would play with when we visited Dad. At the time, we were told that he was her stepson, a friendly and energetic kid who seemed to enjoy our visits as much as we enjoyed his. Everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as it could seem when you're meeting a new family after your own has broken apart. However, visits to Dad started to become less and less frequent. What had once been every weekend then turned into some weekends, and suddenly, we didn't see him at all. There was no official goodbye or a clear reason. One day he was just gone. My brother and I asked questions, of course, but the answers we received were always vague, as if there was something our mother didn't want us to know. "He's busy," she would tell us. "He has a new life." That response always left me unsatisfied, but over time I learned to stop asking. Time passed, and although my father's absence always felt like an open wound, life went on. My mother did her best to be strong for us, to give us a normal childhood despite Dad's absence. During those years, we grew used to not seeing him. My brother and I learned to fill that void with other things: friends, school, sports. But as we grew older, that sense that something wasn't right stayed with me, like a missing piece in the puzzle of our family story. When I turned 13, my life changed again, this time in a completely unexpected way. I clearly remember the day my mother called me into her room. Her voice had a different tone than usual, as if it were weighed down by something she had been holding back for a long time. I sat on the bed in front of her, nervous without knowing why. My mother took a few seconds before speaking, as if gathering the courage needed to say what was coming. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I sat still, watching her eyes that suddenly seemed much more tired than I remembered. It's about your dad, and about that boy you used to play with at his house." My heart started to beat faster, a mix of curiosity and fear taking hold of me. My mind began to wander, wondering what could be so important that my mother felt the need to tell me after so many years. "Do you remember when I told you he was her stepson?" she asked, her eyes fixed on me. I nodded slowly, although I already knew what was coming next was going to change everything I thought I knew. "He wasn't her stepson," she continued, and in that moment, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. That boy was his son from an affair he had with that woman while we were still married. My mother's words echoed in my head like a bell. My breathing became unsteady as I tried to process what I had just heard. The boy I had played with whom I had shared so many afternoons at my father's house, wasn't his stepson. He was his son, my half-brother, and I had no idea. For years that secret had been kept from me, and suddenly the entire story of my family was being rewritten in front of me. My mother kept talking, explaining how my father had started an affair with that woman before leaving our home, how he had lived a double life for a long time without me knowing, and how finally, when everything was discovered, he decided to leave and start a new family with her. The revelation hit me with an intensity I wasn't prepared for. I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and pain that I didn't know how to handle. How could they have hidden something so important from me? How could I have spent so much time playing with my half-brother without even knowing it? For years, I had lived with an incomplete picture of my family, believing that everything had fallen apart simply because it didn't work out, when in reality, there was a betrayal that had been kept hidden. After that conversation with my mother, everything changed. The relationship I had with the memory of my father transformed in an irreversible way. I no longer saw him as the man who had to leave because things didn't work out with my mother. Now I saw him as someone who had betrayed our family, who had made promises he didn't keep, and who had chosen a new life while leaving us behind. His absence, which had felt like a painful loss for so long, was now mixed with a sense of betrayal I couldn't ignore. I started thinking about my half-brother, about how I had shared moments of childhood with him without knowing we were family. I wondered if he had known the whole time, if he had also been in the dark like me. That uncertainty tormented me. The idea that my father had kept that lie for so long filled me with resentment, but at the same time, a deep sadness. I had lost not only my father, but also a part of myself, a part of my family identity that I never knew existed. My mother's revelation opened a wound that would take a long time to heal. I learned that the truth, no matter how hard it is, always finds a way to come out, even if it arrives years later. And with that truth came many questions. What else had been kept from me? What other lies were buried in our family's history? But in the end, what hurt the most was realizing that I had spent so many years not knowing the truth about my own father, about my own family. Growing up, I always knew something wasn't quite right in my parents' marriage. The tension in the house was palpable, as if the air was charged with static electricity, ready to explode at any moment. Although they never told me directly that they were having problems, it wasn't necessary. The shouts echoing from their bedroom at night, the constant arguments in the kitchen, and the long, uncomfortable silences during dinner told me everything. Sometimes, when I was in my room, I could hear the distant murmur of a disagreement that escalated, turning into a full-blown argument. And I, like any child, would shrink under the covers, trying not to listen, hoping the storm would pass. My father had issues with alcohol, that too was obvious, although in my child's mind I didn't fully understand it. I just knew that when he came home with that strong smell of liquor, things were going to get worse. My mother would look at him with a mixture of frustration and resignation, as if she no longer had the strength to argue but couldn't help herself. Sometimes the fights erupted so quickly it seemed as if they had been waiting all day to let loose. My mother would accuse him of his behavior, of not keeping his promises to quit drinking, and he would respond with shouts, denials, and accusations. It was a cycle that repeated itself over and over, like a scratched record they couldn't escape. I remember a couple of times when my father simply disappeared. He didn't say where he was going. He just left. I would wake up in the morning, and the chair where he usually sat was empty, his plate on the table untouched. My mother tried to act like everything was fine, but she couldn't hide the worry on her face. I knew my father was sleeping in his car, parked somewhere in the city, but at the time I didn't understand why. I thought maybe he just needed a break, a breather from the constant fighting. But what I didn't know was that those disappearances reflected something much deeper: my parents' inability to face their problems in a healthy way. Despite it all, they never divorced. There was never a serious conversation about separating, at least not that I knew of. They always came back to each other, as if they were trapped in a vicious circle. With my innocent childhood perspective, I didn't understand why. When I started asking questions around 10 or 12 years old about why they didn't separate if they seemed so unhappy, I always got the same response: we love each other too much. That explanation confused me. How could they love each other when they were always fighting? How could love be the reason they stayed together when it seemed all they did was hurt each other? It didn't make sense to me at the time, but as I grew older, I began to understand that the love they had wasn't simple or ideal. It was something much more complex, full of contradictions and darkness. When I entered my teenage years, things started to change, slowly but noticeably. The fights between my parents became less frequent. There were still arguments, of course, but they weren't the epic battles of before. It was as if they had reached a point where they had both decided to stop fighting over what they couldn't change and simply accepted each other's imperfections. My father still drank, although not with the same intensity. My mother still criticized him for certain things, but she no longer did so with the same vehemence. It was a strange calm, a tense peace, like walking on thin ice, knowing it could break at any moment. I noticed they were spending more time together, and although it didn't always look like the perfect image of a happy couple, there was a change. Sometimes I would see them sitting on the couch watching TV without saying a word, but there was something in their silence that didn't seem as heavy as before. They even started making jokes with each other, small remarks I could never have imagined hearing when I was younger. They exchanged sarcastic comments, teased each other's flaws, and although those jokes often touched on sensitive topics like the fights or the times my father disappeared, there was something in their tone that suggested that, in some way, they had made peace with their shared history. As time went on, their relationship began to seem, at least on the surface, more solid than it had been throughout my childhood. It seemed they had found a way to coexist without tearing each other apart. But behind that facade of normalcy, I knew something deeper was going on. I knew their problems hadn't disappeared. They had simply transformed into something they could manage better. But what I didn't understand at the time was just how much their shared story had been a series of battles and reconciliations, of betrayals and forgiveness. A story they now recounted jokingly as if it were just another anecdote. In recent years, my parents' relationship has reached a level of comfort that, honestly, I never thought was possible. They have gone from being that couple who seemed on the verge of exploding at any moment to being two people who, though scarred and wounded, have learned to live with those scars. But what surprised me more than their apparent reconciliation was the way they now allowed themselves to joke about everything they had done to each other. Those jokes, though they seem lighthearted on the surface, are loaded with a history of pain and betrayal. "Remember that time you slept in the car for 3 days?" my mother says to my father jokingly, while he laughs as if it's the funniest thing in the world. Or when my father quips with a smile, "Well, if she had left me before, we wouldn't be here now." And they both burst into laughter, even though I know that behind that joke are years of resentment and wounds that never fully healed. It's strange to hear those jokes. On one hand, I'm glad they can talk about those things without fighting, that they've reached a point where they can remember the darkest moments of their relationship without it tearing them apart. But on the other hand, I can't help but feel they are minimizing the real pain that was present in those moments. To me, those aren't just funny anecdotes. They are memories of a childhood where I constantly feared my family would fall apart. However, over time, I've learned to accept that the way my parents deal with their past isn't necessarily the way I would. For them, perhaps turning those experiences into jokes is their way of moving forward, of not letting the past continue to affect them. Maybe it's their way of acknowledging what they've lived through without letting it define them. For me, though, those jokes led to a revelation. My parents' story wasn't just a series of ups and downs. It was a complex narrative of difficult decisions, of mistakes made, and ultimately of two people who, for some reason, decided to stay together despite everything. As I grew older and more mature, I began to piece together the true story behind my parents' marriage. I no longer settled for the simplistic excuse of, "we love each other too much." I wanted to know more, to understand how it was possible for two people who had hurt each other so much to stay together. And more importantly, how they had managed to find some sort of peace. Little by little, through casual comments and careful observations, I began to put the puzzle together. I realized that their love wasn't the idealized kind that many people imagine when they think of a long-lasting relationship. It was a love that had survived through difficulties, through mistakes and failures. It wasn't pure or perfect, but it was a love that in some way had endured. My parents, in their own way, had learned to love each other not despite their flaws but through them. They had hurt each other, yes, but they had also healed each other in ways only they could understand. And the more I understood that truth, the more I realized why they stayed together. Not because they were dependent on each other, or because they were too scared to separate, but because after everything they had lived through, they had learned to find comfort in each other's imperfections. They had created a relationship that worked for them, even if to others, it seemed incomprehensible. Now, when I look at my parents, I see two people who have survived the storm, who have found a way to be together in a world where many would have given up long ago. And though I still don't fully understand their story, I've come to accept that for them, love is something that goes beyond what's shown in movies or written in books. It's something complicated, full of nuance, something that isn't always easy to explain. Perhaps after all, love isn't just what keeps you together in the good times, but what allows you to survive the bad ones. And though my parents' story is far from perfect, it's their story. One that, with all its ups and downs, has taught me that love isn't always easy, but sometimes it's enough.